The two officers from the Bayfield County Sheriff's Department were standing in my own bakery kitchen at 4:15 in the afternoon, and the younger one had my flour-dusted canvas bag open on my cooling rack, and he lifted out my green ledger like it was something dead he'd found under a porch. Oscar was leaning in the doorway of the walk-in with his arms folded, and that patient, sorrowing look he got whenever he was about to be cruel and call it honesty. And he said, loud enough for both officers and for Denise from the front counter to hear him, "That's just her shopkeeper's scribble, deputy. Don't waste your time on that. Check the zipper pocket." He said it the way you'd point out where a dog buried a bone. And the deputy, God help him, did check the zipper pocket, and out came a little velvet pouch that did not belong to me, and inside it were 3 rings I had never in my 61 years laid eyes on. One of them, a piece I would later learn, belonged to a woman named Rhonda Pelletier, who had reported it stolen off her dresser 11 days before. I want you to understand about that ledger, because Oscar never did. It was a plain thing, cloth-bound, in a deep bottle green, gone soft and pale at the spine from 31 years of my thumb, and I kept every number that mattered to me inside it in pencil, because my mother kept hers in pencil, because you can erase a mistake, but you can never quite hide an ink blot lie. He'd been calling it my scribble for the better part of 2 decades. He had no earthly idea what all was written in it, or how far back the figures went, or whose name sat on which line. He thought it was a grocery list with pretensions. That was the single most expensive mistake that man ever made, and he made a lot of them. And I say that with no more heat than a woman reading off a weather report. But I'm getting ahead of myself, the way my granddaughter says I always do, so let me back the truck up. I was born Mara Jean Ostrander in 1965 in a lake town called Cedar Ridge on the Wisconsin side of Lake Superior, where the ice heaves up on the shore in February like somebody plowed a field of broken glass, and the whole town smells of wood smoke, and the co-op's fish boil from October clean through May. My mother, Ingrid, ran the little bakery on Copper Street that her mother had run before her, and I grew up standing on an upturned milk crate at the marble slab, dusting cornstarch off Springerly molds with a rabbit-foot brush, because that is what we made and sold and were known for. We were not fancy people. We were the people the fancy people bought their kringle from. That ledger came to me the spring I turned 19. In 1984, on the day my mother's hands got too bad with the arthritis to hold a pencil steady, and she sat me down at the oilcloth-covered table in the back and slid it across to me and said, "Mara, the bread's just flour and patience. Anybody can learn that part. This is the part that keeps the lights on, and this is the part folks will try to take from you, so you learn it and you keep it and you don't let a living soul but you touch it." Then she showed me every column. She showed me the accounts, the ones the customers owed and the ones we owed, and the little starred lines that meant a debt somebody had paid back in kindness instead of cash. And way in the back, in a section she'd ruled off herself with a straight edge, the property. Because here is a thing about my mother that nobody in Cedar Ridge fully grasped, and it is the thing this whole story turns on. Ingrid Ostrander did not just bake. She bought. Every time a lot came up on Copper Street or Dock Road for back taxes, every time a fisherman drowned in debt or a widow needed to sell quick before winter, my mother, in her flour apron, quietly wrote a check, and she wrote the deed into the back of that green ledger in her own square hand. By the time she passed in 1998, she owned 9 buildings along the old commercial strip, free and clear, and not one person outside that ledger and one lawyer in Ashland knew it, because she rented them out through a plain little entity she'd named, with no vanity whatsoever, Copper Street Holdings. She left the whole works to me, the bakery, the buildings, the entity, and the ledger that was the only complete map of any of it. I met Oscar Keller in 1989 at a snowmobile club fish fry in Washburn, and I will be honest with you because there's no percentage in lying to yourself at 61. I liked him. He was tall and sure of himself, and he had a way of talking about right and wrong like the two of them were his personal acquaintances. He sold insurance then, and he was good at it because he genuinely believed every word of every warning he ever gave you about the storm coming for your roof. That was the thing about Oscar. From the first day to the last one in that courtroom, he was never a con man. A con man knows he's lying. Oscar believed. He believed he was the smartest, most principled fellow in any room, and he believed it so hard that the believing turned other people into obstacles between him and his own goodness. We married in 1991. Our daughter Colleen was born in 1993. For a while it was fine, better than fine. He kept his insurance office, and I kept the bakery, and we bought a house on Larch Lane. And I did not tell him the full weight of what my mother had left me, and I have asked myself 100 times whether that was the crack that let all the water in. But I don't think so. I think it just meant that when the water came, I had a boat, and he didn't know it. Here is where I have to slow down and tell you about the erosion, because it did not happen all at once. It happened the way the lake takes the clay bank below the lighthouse, a spoonful at a time, until one spring, the whole tree's in the water. It started around 2009, after my mother had been gone 11 years, and Oscar's insurance business had gotten tired of him. His clients had started to leave, because it turns out people don't love being told they're fools who don't understand risk, even when it's true. And a man who's certain he's right does not adjust. He just gets louder. So Oscar came to me with a plan. And the plan was that we should buy the old Hendrickson hardware building on Copper Street and open a proper store, a real destination, kitchenware and gourmet goods and my baked goods in the front. And he'd run it, and it'd be ours. And I looked at that ledger, at the green cover I'd rubbed pale in the same place my mother had, and I did a thing I've regretted with a specific, grinding regret ever since. I already owned the Hendrickson building. It was line 4 in the back section, bought by Copper Street Holdings in 2003 for $41,000 at a tax sale. But instead of telling Oscar the truth, I let Copper Street Holdings loan our new business the money to renovate and stock it, $112,000, secured by the store's inventory and fixtures and by a personal guarantee. All of it papered up proper by Josephine Vane, the attorney over in Ashland, who'd taken over my mother's little file after old Mr. Dunmore retired. I let Oscar think he'd talked a bank into it. I let him have the feeling of it. He named the store Keller & Co., and he never once put my name on the sign. And when I mentioned it, gentle, over a supper of walleye and boiled potatoes, he set his fork down and gave me the sorrowing look and said, "Mara, honey, the store needs to project confidence, and Keller does that. Ostrander sounds like a bakery." And I let that go, too. You let a lot go, spooning clay off the bank, telling yourself the tree's fine. The next few years are a string of those spoonfuls, and I'll give you the 3 that mattered most, because they're the ones I laid awake over. The first was the recipe. I had a Springerla recipe, my grandmother's, an anise cookie stamped with a wooden mold of a rooster, and the mold and the recipe both came down to me. I'd been selling those roosters at the bakery every Christmas since I was a girl, $4 a piece, 1,000 of them a season sometimes, folks driving up from Duluth just for them. When we opened Keller & Company, Oscar wanted them in the store, boxed up fancy at $11 a half dozen, and I said, sure. Then one January, I found he'd had a printer in Superior make up a whole line of packaging that said, "A Keller family tradition since 1991, which was the year we married, as though the rooster cookies sprang fully formed from the head of Oscar Keller. When I told him that recipe was Ostrander, 4 generations of it, he told me I was being small, that a brand was bigger than a bloodline, and that nobody wanted to buy their Christmas cookies from a story about somebody's dead grandmother. I remember I went back to the bakery kitchen that night, and I took the green ledger down off its shelf, and I just held it, the way you'd hold a person's hand. And I turned to the page where my mother had written, in 1984, the cost of the very rabbit-foot brush I still used, 35 cents. And I felt the whole line of women behind me, and I did not say one word to Oscar. That's the part he'd have wanted to see, the tears, the fight. I gave him nothing. I just wrote the date in the ledger, and next to it, in my own square hand, one word: Rooster. A marker. So I'd remember I'd let it happen. The second spoonful was Courtney Blaisdell. She came on at Keller & Company in 2014 as the brand consultant, which as far as I could tell meant she rearranged the front window and agreed with Oscar. She was 34 then to my 49, and she had a laugh she kept on a shelf and took down whenever Oscar said something. And I am not going to pretend I was above noticing the mechanics of it. What I noticed most, though, wasn't the flirting. It was that Courtney started asking me questions about the business's finances that a window dresser had no cause to ask. Who held the note? What the terms were? Whether the family, she'd say it just like that, the family, like she was already fitted for it, actually owned the building or just leased it. And I would smile and dust my hands on my apron and tell her that Oscar handled all that, which was a lie, and which she believed, which told me everything about how little either of them had ever looked past the flower on my hands. The third spoonful, and the one that broke something loose in me, was the rent. Because I want to be clear about who all lived inside that green ledger. Oscar's mother, a hard, sharp, tiny woman named Delphine Keller, 80 by then, lived in the second-floor apartment above the old Nyquist Pharmacy on Copper Street. She had lived there since her husband died in 1996, and she had lived there all those years, paying $650 a month, well under half of what the place was worth, because, and Delphine never knew this, and Oscar certainly never knew this, that building was line 7 in the back of my ledger. Copper Street Holdings owned it. I was Delphine's landlord. I had been her landlord the whole time she'd sat at her son's Thanksgiving table and told me my kringle was a little heavy this year, dear. I had kept her rent low for 15 years out of nothing but a plain decency I got from my mother, who would have kept it low too, and I never breathed a word, because it wasn't a favor if she knew about it. It was just the right thing, done quiet. So those were my spoonfuls, and I carried the ledger through all of them. And I want you to understand I wasn't scheming. I was a grandmother by then. Colleen and her husband had died in the same wet March when their Cavalier went off the causeway on the way home from Duluth in 2017. And I had taken in their little girl, my granddaughter Wren, who was 6 that spring and 11 when all this came to a head. And every single thing I did in those years, I did with one eye on that child. The ledger by then wasn't a weapon. It was the roof I was keeping over Wren's head. That's all it was. Now, the offense. By the spring of 2024, Oscar had decided he wanted a divorce. And more than a divorce, he wanted to come out of it owning Keller & Co. free and clear. And I believe with my whole heart that Courtney is the one who did the arithmetic and figured out that the cleanest way for Oscar to get the store was to make sure Oscar was the injured, upright party and Mara was the disgraced one. Because in a lake town like Cedar Ridge, where everybody's known you since you were on the milk crate, character is currency. And if you can make people believe the pastry chef grandmother is a common thief, well, then a judge and a whole town will hand her husband anything he asks for and call it justice. I found out later, from the officers themselves, and from what came out in Discovery, exactly how it went. Oscar had gotten friendly, over the winter, with people at a couple of estate sales and a consignment place in Bayfield, and 3 pieces of jewelry had gone missing from 3 different homes where he'd had reason to be. He kept them in that velvet pouch. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in April, he came into my bakery kitchen while I was at the sink, and he slipped that pouch into the zipper pocket of the canvas bag I carried between the bakery and the store every day, the bag everyone in town had seen on my shoulder for years. And then he drove straight home and called the sheriff's department and told them, sorrowing, principled, that he had reason to believe his wife had been stealing from the elderly clients whose homes she delivered cookies to at Christmas. He believed it made him a good man. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He'd built a version of me in his head, a small, dishonest woman with a scribble book, and planting the rings didn't feel like a lie to him. It felt like helping the truth along. So there they stood in my kitchen, the two deputies, and there was the pouch, and there was Rhonda Pelletier's stolen ring winking up under the fluorescent lights, and there was Oscar in the doorway saying, "That's just her shopkeeper's scribble, deputy," about the one object in that room that was actually going to matter. And Denise from the counter with both hands over her mouth and the smell of the day's last Kringle going stale on the rack. I'll tell you what I did, and it is the closest thing to a boast I'll allow myself in this whole telling. I did not fall apart. I did not raise my voice or plead my innocence, which is what a guilty person does anyway. I dried my hands slow on my apron, and I asked the older deputy, a decent man named Gruber, whose wedding cake I had made in 2009, if I might make a phone call before we went any further, and he said I could. And I picked up the wall phone in the kitchen, the avocado green one that had hung there since my Mother's Day, and I called Josephine Vane in Ashland, and when she picked up, I said just 4 words. I said, "Josephine, it's happening. Come." And then I hung up, and I folded my hands, and I waited. And the waiting was the loudest thing I have ever done. They took me down to Washburn, and they booked me, and I sat in that little cinder block room that smelled of burnt coffee and pine cleaner for 4 hours, and I did not cry there either, though I will not tell you I didn't want to, because Wren was with a sitter and getting scared, and I was her whole world, and I was in a cell. But I held the shape of myself. Josephine got there and got me out on my own recognizance by 9 that night, and driving home in her old Buick along the dark lake shore with the ice out just starting so the lake was making that groaning, cracking music it makes in April, she said to me, "Mara, they think they've got you. Rhonda Pelletier's ring in your bag. You understand this is a felony." And I looked out at the black water and I said, "Josephine, they've got a stranger. They've got the woman Oscar made up. They never once looked in the ledger." And she went quiet, and then she said, "Tell me about the ledger." So I told her, in her kitchen, past midnight, over a pot of red rose tea, everything my mother had built, and everything I owned, and everything the back section of that green book said. I told her Copper Street Holdings owned the Hendrickson building, where Keller and Company sat. I told her the store didn't have a banknote. It had my note, $112,000, secured by every fixture and stick of inventory Oscar thought was his, with a personal guarantee he'd signed in 2009 without reading, the way he never read anything he was certain about. I told her Copper Street Holdings was Delphine Keller's landlord, and that I'd been carrying that old woman at $650 a month for 15 years out of pure mercy. Josephine set her tea down and looked at me for a long moment across her own oilcloth, and she said, "Mara Jean, do you understand that your husband has spent 30 years living inside a house you own, running a store you own, on money you loaned him, married to a woman he thinks is a shopkeeper?" And I said yes, I understood that. I'd understood it for years. I just never had a reason cold enough to use it. Now I had one. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a lesser woman, or a woman in one of those stories, does something loud and reckless, and I did not. I did not go set fire to anything. My mother raised me to believe that the person who keeps the best records wins, and wins quietly, and cannot be argued with, because the record is the record. So over the next 6 weeks, while Oscar and Courtney went around Cedar Ridge with their sorrowing faces, telling the ladies at St. Anselm's and the men at the Legion Hall that poor Oscar had been robbed under his own roof, that they always knew something was off about Mara, that it was a shame about the little granddaughter having to grow up in that, I did the patient thing. I did the thing you do with a stubborn doe. I let it rest, and I let it show me what it was. First, Josephine and a private investigator named Hollis Ojimpa from Superior pulled the threads on the jewelry, and they came apart fast, because Oscar was certain, and certain men are sloppy. There was a receipt from the Bayfield consignment shop with his name on it from a day I could prove I was in Duluth at a restaurant supply show ordering a new proofer, and I had the invoice, and a photo Wren's sitter had texted me of the two of us at the aerial lift bridge. There was a clerk at that consignment shop who remembered Oscar asking oddly specific questions about which local families were downsizing. And there was Rhonda Pelletier herself, who, when Hollis showed her a photo lineup, did not pick me. She picked out a man who had come to her estate sale sniffing around the good stuff, and that man was Oscar Keller. By the middle of May, the district attorney over in Washburn had quietly dropped every charge against me and opened a file on my husband instead, and the town, which is a fickle and hungry thing, began to turn the way ice turns, all at once, with a great cracking noise, and now it was Oscar who couldn't get served at the Copper Kettle Diner without the whole counter going still. But I want to be honest that the criminal side of it was never the point for me. Oscar could have gone to prison for the jewelry, and that would have been the law's business, the state of Wisconsin's business, not mine. My business, the thing I meant to do with my own hands and my own book, was different. My business was that this man had tried to take my name, had spent 15 years taking it, spoonful by spoonful, the rooster, the sign, the shopkeeper's scribble, and I meant to take it back so completely and so legally that no soul in Cedar Ridge would ever again be confused about whose town this was and whose flower was on whose hands. So while the criminal case fell apart on him, Josephine and I built the other thing. The quiet thing, the thing in the ledger. And I filed for divorce myself, first, in Bayfield County, and I did it the week the charges against me were dropped, because timing is a kind of mercy you extend to yourself. The divorce was set to be heard in the Bayfield County Courthouse in Washburn, a beautiful old brownstone thing up the hill from the water, on a Thursday morning in the middle of September. And I knew from Josephine that Oscar was walking into that courtroom believing he was going to walk out with Keller and Company. His lawyer, a slick fellow from Eau Claire named Prescott, whom he could scarcely afford, had told him the store was a marital asset and that Oscar, as the one who ran it day to day, had the stronger claim. And Oscar believed it, because Oscar believed the store was his the way he believed the rooster cookie was his, by force of his own certainty. Courtney came to court in a cream-colored suit and sat in the second row like it was already a wedding. And here's the part I did the night before, the preparation. Because a reckoning is not a lightning bolt, it is a thing you set up carefully and then simply allow to be true. The evening before the hearing, I sat at the marble slab in my bakery, alone, with Wren asleep upstairs, and I took the green ledger down, and I laid beside it 3 documents that Josephine had drawn up and that I had signed that afternoon in her office in Ashland. The first was a notice of default and acceleration on the Keller and Company. Loan. Because the loan agreement, the real one, my one, not the bank fairy tale Oscar told himself, had a clause, standard as salt, that let the lender call the entire balance due at once if the borrower did any of a list of things, and one of those things was being charged with a felony that materially affected the business, and another was defaulting on any other obligation to the lender. And Oscar had done both. The second document was a foreclosure notice on the store's assets, everything the loan was secured by, the fixtures, the inventory, the beautiful copper-topped counters he'd been so proud of. And the third, the one I sat with the longest, was a new lease notice for the apartment above the old Nyquist Pharmacy, raising Delphine Keller's rent from $650 a month to the honest market figure of $1,400, effective the 1st of October. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear, but because the pretense was over, and a woman does not keep doing a stranger's family a 15-year kindness after that family tries to send her to prison. I signed all 3 at Josephine's kitchen table, and I did not gloat and I did not weep, I just watched my own square hand fill the lines the way my mother's had filled them, and I felt her there, close as the anise smell that never leaves that kitchen. And I thought, all right, Ingrid, watch this. This is the part folks will try to take from you. And I kept it. Then I closed the ledger, and I made a batch of rooster cookies, the real ones, at 11 at night, because I couldn't sleep and because the mold fits my hand the way it fit hers. And I stamped out 4 dozen roosters and let them dry overnight on the rack. And that is a true and mundane thing about me that I will not apologize for. The night before I took a man's whole world apart, I baked. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom was warm and full. Half of Cedar Ridge had come up the hill to Washburn to watch, because a small town runs on this kind of theater the way a wood stove runs on split oak. Oscar sat at his table with Prescott in the good Navy suit, radiating that patient certainty. And when I came in with Josephine and set my canvas bag on our table, he actually smiled at me, the sorrowing smile. And I understood that he still thought the story was the one he'd written, the one where he was the wronged and upright man freeing himself from a small, dishonest woman, even with the jewelry charges hanging over him. Even then, that is how certain he was. Courtney had her wedding face on. Prescott went first, and he made his case for the store. And it was a fine case if you didn't know what I knew. Keller and Company was a going concern. Oscar had built it and ran it. It should come to him, and Mrs. Keller could keep her little bakery and her buildings, and everyone would go home. He said her little bakery, and I watched Oscar nod along, gravely, generously, a man dividing the world fairly. Then Josephine stood up, and she is not a loud woman, my Josephine. She is a slow and terrible woman when she means it. And she said to the judge, a sensible woman named Halloran, who'd been on the bench 19 years, that before the court divided the marital assets, the court would want to understand the ownership structure of those assets, and that she had documents. And she walked to the table, and she picked up the green ledger. I'd brought it. I'd carried it up that hill in my flour bag, because it deserved to be in the room. And she said, Your Honor, opposing counsel has referred to a store and a building and a business. I'd like to establish, on the record, who owns each of those things. And she began, slow, to lay it out. She laid out Copper Street Holdings. She laid out that it was mine alone, inherited from my mother in 1998, never commingled, never marital. She laid out that the Hendrickson building where Keller and Company sat was owned outright by Copper Street Holdings. She had the deed, recorded in 2003, $41,000 at a tax sale, 6 years before Oscar ever dreamed up his store. She laid out that Keller and Company did not own its own premises and never had. It was a tenant, and its landlord was me. And then she laid out the loan, and I watched it land on Oscar's face, because this was the one he'd told himself the biggest lie about. There was no bank. There had never been a bank. The $112,000 that built his store had come from Copper Street Holdings, from me, secured by every fixture and every last spatula in the place, and personally guaranteed by Oscar Keller, whose signature Josephine held up from 2009 on a document he had plainly never read. Prescott was on his feet objecting, and Josephine just kept setting papers on the clerk's table, one after another. The deed, the note, the guarantee, the recorded liens, and each one was the record, and the record cannot be argued with. That was my mother's whole religion, and it held. And then Josephine said the quiet part, the part I'd signed the night before at her kitchen table. She said that as of that morning, the lender had declared the Keller and Company loan in default and accelerated it, that the full balance was due, that the borrower could not pay it, and that the lender was foreclosing on the secured assets of the store. Effective immediately. She said the fixtures and inventory of Keller & Co. now belonged to Copper Street Holdings. She said the building had always belonged to Copper Street Holdings. She said there was, in the plainest possible terms, No store left for the court to award to anyone because the store had been standing on my land, built with my money the whole time, and I had, that morning, quietly and completely and legally taken it back. I watched Oscar the whole time. I owe you an honest account of it because the prompt of my own life demanded honesty, and I'll give it to you here too. He did not go white, and he did not weep, and he did not crumble. And if you were hoping for that, I was too, once, and I've made my peace with not getting it. What Oscar did was worse, in a way, and more true to him. He got angrier and more certain. He leaned over to Prescott, and I heard him hiss, "This isn't legal. She's a baker. She doesn't own anything. This is a trick." And when Judge Halloran, having read the deeds and the note and the guarantee for herself, told him plainly that the documents were valid and recorded and that Mrs. Keller appeared to own everything she said she owned, Oscar stood up, uninvited, and said, "Your Honor, with respect, this woman keeps her books in pencil in a grocery notebook. You cannot possibly take a scribble book over a real business." And Judge Halloran looked at him over her glasses, and she looked at the green ledger sitting on the clerk's table, and she said, "Mr. Keller, that scribble book, as you call it, contains recorded deeds, executed notes, and your own notarized signature. It is the most complete set of records in this courtroom. Sit down." He never repented. He never once, from that morning to this day, admitted he'd done a single thing wrong. He believed to the end that a great trick had been played on an honest man, and the trick was simply that I had let him underestimate me for 30 years and had finally stopped. Courtney did not stay for the ruling. She left during the recess in her cream suit, and I am told she did not so much as look at Oscar on her way out the door. And that was its own small, clean thing, the sight of the wedding face folding up and leaving. Because she'd never wanted him, she'd wanted the store. And there was no store. The divorce came through clean. I kept everything that had always been mine, which was everything that mattered. The bakery, the 9 buildings, Copper Street Holdings, the note, and the ledger. Oscar walked out of the marriage with his good Navy suit and his certainty, and, that winter, a criminal trial in Washburn for the jewelry, at which Rhonda Pelletier pointed at him from the stand, and he was convicted. And none of that was my doing. That was just the law finishing what he'd started when he decided to make me a stranger. Delphine Keller's rent went to $1,400 on the 1st of October, and she moved, and I did not lose one wink of sleep over it. And I'll tell you why. I had carried that woman for 15 years without her ever knowing it or thanking me for a kindness she didn't know she was getting. And a kindness done quiet is a gift. But the same kindness, demanded and unearned, is just a fool's tax. And I was done being anybody's fool. Where the mercy had been real, I'd kept it real for a decade and a half. When they killed the reason for it, I closed the account, in pencil, in the ledger, with a date. Now the last part, the part I want to close on, because triumph is a cold supper if you eat it alone, and I did not eat it alone. By the next Christmas, the front room of what had been Keller & Company was open again, on Copper Street, in the Hendrickson building, under a new sign I paid a fellow in Ashland to hand letter. And the sign said Ostrander and Wren in green, and under it, in smaller letters, a Cedar Ridge bakery since 1921, which is the truth, which is my grandmother's true year, 4 generations deep, no man's wedding date pasted over it. Wren was 12 by then, and she'd taken to the Springer Lamolds the way I did on my milk crate. And it is her rooster on the box now, her name on the sign, and the recipe is back where it belongs. $4 a piece, 1,000 a season, folks driving up from Duluth. The green ledger sits on a shelf in the new kitchen at eye level, where I can put my hand on it, and I've started teaching Wren the columns, the accounts, and the starred lines of debts paid back in kindness, and the ruled-off section in the back where the property lives. And I tell her what my mother told me, that the bread is just flour and patience. But this is the part folks will try to take from you. And on the night we opened, after we'd locked up, Josephine came by with a bottle of good Wisconsin brandy and 2 juice glasses, because neither of us owns a proper snifter, and neither of us ever will. And we sat at the marble slab with the roosters cooling on the rack and the lake groaning its September groan out past the breakwater, and I poured us each a finger, and I did not make a toast about revenge or winning or any of that, because that was never what it was. I raised my glass to the woman who'd driven a dark lakeshore at midnight to sit at her own oilcloth table and ask a frightened baker to tell her about a green book. And I said, "Josephine, you never once looked at me and saw a shopkeeper. Thank you for that." And she touched her glass to mine and said, "Mara Jean, I looked at you and saw your mother." And that, of everything that happened that whole long year, is the line I kept.